Hello everyone, and a very warm welcome to this month's CRAE webinar. My name's Laura Crane. I'm the Interim Director of the Centre for Research in Autism and Education, or CRAE, and we are based at UCL's Faculty of Education and Society at University College London in the UK. To tell you a little bit about us, at CRAE we conduct autism research, and really importantly we aim for our research to be on topics that really matter to autistic people and their allies, and that really genuinely make a difference to their day-to-day lives. And we take a really participatory approach in all that we do, so making sure that we involve the autistic and broader autism communities in our work at multiple levels. And at CRAE, we've got a particular commitment to making sure that knowledge on autism is shared beyond academia, and that everyone can engage with both our work, but also that of other researchers and advocates, and to do so in a really engaging and accessible way. And that's one of the reasons that we're really pleased to be able to run our CRAE webinar series. And at this point, I'd like to say a particular thank you to all of our funders, our supporters, and our team members who make these events possible, and particularly to the Pears Foundation, who really generously support our work at CRAE, and without whom these events wouldn't be possible. So that's a little about us. And now I'm really pleased to welcome our speaker for today's webinar, Dr. Rebecca Wood. Becky is currently a senior lecturer in the Department of Early Childhood and Education at the University of East London, although she'll be moving to the University of Glasgow very soon to take up a lectureship there. And if you're not yet familiar with Becky's research, all I can say is that you are really missing out. Becky has written some of my very favourite autism education research papers, particularly her paper on intense interests and her paper on understanding and value in the communication of autistic children in schools, which are both really, really thoughtful and thought-provoking articles that we encourage all of our students here at the IOE to read. Becky's also written a really brilliant book called Inclusive Education for Autistic Children, which I'd highly recommend. And relevant today, Becky's the principal investigator of the Autistic School Staff Project, which I'm really proud to play a little role in. And Becky's been lead editor of the book that's associated with that project called Learning from Autistic Teachers: How to Be a Neurodiversity Inclusive School, which is out later this month. And Becky really is a very, very valued colleague of mine whose work I really admire. So I'm absolutely delighted that she's here to share her work with the CRAE community today. And if any of our audience members have questions for Becky, you can either put these in the Q&A, or if you prefer to post them anonymously, you can use a website called Slido. And the link to the Slido for those who want to use it should be going in the chat now. So thank you again, Becky, for delivering our CRAE webinar this month, and we really look forward to your talk, Inclusion in School, Learning the Lessons from Autistic Pupils and Teachers. Over to you.
Thank you very much, Laura. I'll share my screen now. Thank you so much for that introduction, Laura. So, as Laura said, I'm currently a senior lecturer in special education at the University of East London, although not actually for much longer. From next month, I'll be at the University of Glasgow. So if anybody does want to get in touch, that's where you'll be able to find me from May onwards. So today, I'm going to talk very briefly about the issues faced by autistic children and young people in school. But more broadly, I'll be talking about findings from the Autistic School Staff Project. This is funded by the John and Lorna Wing Foundation. We have, in different aspects of the project, approximately 200 participants in various roles in the UK and Ireland. And I'm going to draw some parallels between autistic children and autistic adults in school, although I will suggest some caution with that as well. But I'll be suggesting ways in which we can think about better outcomes for all, for autistic children and autistic adults in schools. And I will also signpost to further information and resources at the end of this presentation. So first of all, the problems and difficulties that autistic children experience in school, or often experience in school, are well documented and unfortunately ongoing, We do know that they experience very significant sensory issues, or many autistic children do, particularly in relation to noise, but also experiences such as busy corridors, the dining hall with its smells and with its noise, cluttered classrooms. Autistic children can be subject to very high levels of exclusion as well. There are various forms of internal exclusion. They might be on a part-time timetable. They might not spend much time with the class teacher, being placed with a teaching assistant much of the time. They might be excluded from after-school activities, school trips, that sort of thing, as well as being subject to relatively high rates of external exclusion, by which I mean permanent exclusions and what are now called suspensions, fixed-term exclusions. Their communication and social differences can create problems in the school environment, as well as a monotropic thinking or learning style. That is a tendency to have very strong interests on a relatively narrow range of topics. And these problems combined can exacerbate a need for sameness and a difficulty with change. Although, as you will see through this presentation, our research in relation to adults shows some really interesting nuance with that. All of these issues together can lead to another form of exclusion, which is self-withdrawal, often called school refusal, when levels of stress and anxiety are so high that autistic children cannot attend school. And autistic children and young people generally have poor outcomes on a number of measures. And the illustration there is by Sunny Hallett from my book, Inclusive Education for Autistic Children, which Laura kindly mentioned at the beginning, denoting some of the different sensory experiences that autistic children have to endure in the school environment. Now, the typical responses to the difficulties autistic children experience in school can be to perceive the child as the problem. And this in itself can often trigger interventions designed ostensibly to support the child, and often they can support the child, but they don't always. And often the focus of these interventions can be so that the child does not disrupt the status quo, so that the child fits in with the norms of the school. And so the focus too often is on conformity. These interventions can be framed around the aims and intentions of adults rather than taking a child perspective. And they're often mediated via specialist professionals. The idea is that an autistic child in school needs a specialist professional in order to make sense of them. Now, obviously, specialist professionals, particularly occupational therapists, in my view, can be very helpful for autistic children, but it does nevertheless contribute to a kind of othering process, a sense that the child is not like us, might be weird, odd, strange, that some specialist is needed to make sense of this alien child. The child doesn't belong here. So that can reinforce exclusionary attitudes. And in fact, research has shown that the class teacher is really the linchpin to educational inclusion. If the teacher sees the child as belonging to them, belonging to their class, that's a strong step in a sort of inclusionary direction. And of course, there are examples of good practice, but unfortunately, they're not the norm. In other words, autistic children and young people can be caught within a vicious cycle of exceptionalism, stigma, and exclusion in the school environment. So if I turn now to my work, or our work, should I say, on autistic teachers, more generally in terms of employment, autistic people are underemployed in the sense that they are not working at the level their qualifications might suggest. They are also subject to much higher rates of unemployment, job insecurity. They receive lower pay than the general population, or even other disability groups. So a survey by the Office for National Statistics showed that autistic people are employed at a lower rate than all other disability groups, and that was just last year. In the school sector, as I have just exemplified myself, the focus is almost uniquely on autistic pupils. Much less attention is paid to the staff. In fact, generally, there is a dearth of research on disabled teachers. There is some research on teachers with visual impairments, with physical disabilities, with dyslexia and learning difficulties and other disabilities. And certainly that research is very helpful and very instructive, but there is even less on autistic teachers, although interestingly, this seems to be changing now. So if I talk now about the Autistic School Staff Project, which I lead. So this is divided into 3 phases. And the first phase consisted of an online survey in 2019 across the UK. And for that, we had 149 participants. So these were all people who worked or had worked in schools in the UK in an education role. And we felt it was important to include people who were no longer in the profession to perhaps understand the reasons why that might be. So about a third of our participants had left the school sector at the time of doing the survey. And with regard to the research into teachers with disabilities, the vast majority of the research is actually on teachers alone. But we have actually incorporated a range of roles in our study, which I think is really, really important. So although for that survey, about half of our participants were in fact teachers, and we had 27% were teaching assistants, many other roles were represented. Head teachers, deputy head teachers, early years teachers, heads of department, trainee teachers, SENCOs, and visiting professionals. So it's really key to see that autistic people are fulfilling a range of roles in the school sector. And we didn't even include, for example, non-education roles such as lunchtime assistants, which is definitely something I would like to look into in the future. Then we had phase 2, which consisted of 33 in-depth interviews with phase 1 participants. And because of the timing of phase 2, we were able to include the impact of COVID-19. And I'll be mentioning some aspects of our findings from that phase 2 in this presentation. We're currently in phase 3, and for this we have teams in Poland and the US who have joined us. There are 2 core aspects to this, looking at parents of autistic children, that those parents themselves may or may not be autistic in Poland, the US and the UK, and small case studies of autistic teachers specifically in Poland and the US. Now we're still collecting data for phase 3, so everything I'll be discussing in this presentation will be from phases 1 and 2. So just like autistic children, autistic school staff can experience very significant sensory issues in the school environment. As somebody said, the lights are always too bright, the bells go on far too long. Noise, again, emerges as the most impactful sensory issue, with break times being the noisiest part of the school day. Somebody wrote, therefore, break times are not a break at all. And speaking as someone who used to be a school teacher, I know how incredibly important it is for to have break times as an actual break, unless of course you are on duty. And so for individuals who are not able to have that rest and that respite, it's very punishing. Other sensory impacts such as hot, stuffy classrooms, busy corridors were very problematic. And also the staff room. So again, speaking as a former teacher, the staff room is an incredibly important community space. And it has lots of roles and functions, but the staff room can be, one of our participants said, more noisy than the classrooms. And lunchtimes you have people talking, heating up their lunch in the microwave, the smells of lunch, eating, etc., all very difficult to deal with if you have those sensory sensitivities. It makes it hard to keep going. And we found from a sensory point of view, there were some benefits during remote working due to COVID-19. So if people were working at home, they were more able to manage their own sensory environment. This is actually very important in relation to these issues, to have kind of some control over your sensory environment, or to be able to wear comfortable clothes. And if people were working in school, often the class sizes were reduced. And so this benefited staff and pupils, they considered. Now, dealing with change is an issue that for me has been kind of bubbling along the background of this study and is becoming more and more prominent and being, for me, one of the most interesting aspects of our findings. On a simple level, our participants found multiple changes very difficult to deal with. Something simple like changing classrooms. As somebody said, I'm doing a different job from someone who has their own classroom. So this is something that will particularly impact secondary school teachers, for example, who tend to change classrooms all of the time. And a simple adjustment, like reducing the number of times that somebody has to change classroom, can be very beneficial, it seems to me, for somebody who finds that sort of thing difficult, both from the point of view of change and the sensory environment. Last minute changes from management could be a major source of stress, particularly if these were poorly communicated or the rationale was not clear. So changes that seemed logical and to make sense were easier to deal with, even if they were communicated at the last minute. And the teaching profession itself is, of course, a source of frequent policy changes. Every time we have a new education minister, every time we have a new government, there's a change of education policy. It seems to me people can't sort of stop themselves from tinkering with it. And of course, there were rapid and frequent changes resulting from COVID-19. And the research has shown that school leaders, for example, found this especially difficult, whether or not they were autistic. Sometimes the government would make announcements on a Sunday, which school leaders had to implement the following Monday. And there's a very important intersection between the ability to deal with change and agency. And our study shows that teaching assistants can be particularly impacted by change. And teaching assistants, amongst all of the education staff, have the least agency in a school. So they might not know on a given day which child they're going to be working with. They might be suddenly switched from one child they're expecting to work with to another. They might not know which room they're going to be in or what activities they might be expected to do. Whereas senior staff, on the other hand, in our study, seem to actually quite enjoy change to a certain degree, particularly if they were the people who were able to implement change themselves. And so change is actually quite a nuanced issue, according to our findings. So it's not just simply a question of not liking change. There are lots of factors that intersect with this. And so having agency and control made changes much more manageable. So I'll just demonstrate this diagrammatically. So first of all, how change was communicated, how clearly it was communicated, and whether or not it was done with plenty of notice was very important. Being provided with a rationale for change, it making sense, made changes easier to deal with. The frequency of changes, if there weren't too many piling up all at once, also made them easier to deal with. And in particular, agency. And actually, this wasn't necessarily even to do with the position that the person had in the school. So there was one teaching assistant in our study who was on different committees, and so was involved in policy changes, and so therefore had a role to play in the changes that were made. Now, there are many social differences and social issues shown by our study. And interestingly, staff, our participants said they can cope with social interaction issues if they are linked with their working role. So if somebody is running a meeting in connection with their role or giving a presentation or something like that, it's much easier to deal with. But general social situations like staff get-togethers are much more problematic. They might be experienced as a nightmare, or somebody said, I'm hiding in the toilets or going home early. School politics are difficult to navigate. And again, having been a teacher, school politics are certainly very difficult all of the time. Being chatty and networking, quick fire communication, gossiping, bitching, those sort of social interaction styles were not liked and found to be very difficult. And the staff room, which of course is a really important community space for staff, it's the one place where the children don't go, parents don't go there either. Somebody wrote that they felt like an alien in the staff room, they didn't feel welcome. Somebody else said that in the staff room they fear being ostracized and committing faux pas, not knowing when to join in with conversations, or if joining with conversations was even allowed. And so combine that with the sensory issues in the staff room really becomes quite a sort of difficult space. And a few people actually said that if they didn't ask about well-being, so for example, if a colleague had been away for a certain amount of time because they were ill, when they came back, the autistic colleague might not ask about how they are and be perceived as uncaring because the autistic person is perhaps just very focused on the job. So lots of social differences in relation to colleagues, but also in relation to parents as well. Now, issues of diagnosis, by which I mean being able to be open about being autistic, is absolutely central to turning around what is, for many of our participants anyway, quite a difficult situation in the school environment. So from our survey, 55% of the staff who were no longer working in schools and 35% of those who were still working said that nobody at all knew that they were autistic. And that is colleagues, management, parents and pupils. Just to say, though, that a number of the staff who were no longer working in schools said that they didn't know themselves that they were autistic at that time. So that does mediate that statistic. Nevertheless, being able to be open about being autistic is a really, really central issue in our study. One reason for this, and a key issue, was poor treatment of autistic children, or having to hear autism discussed in a stigmatizing way if colleagues were talking about an autistic child in a very negative and prejudiced way, or having to endure inadequate autism training. And somebody said that even a specialist environment, an autism specialist environment, was actually the least autistic friendly place imaginable. So first of all, these issues were just in themselves quite upsetting, but it also made participants very reluctant to share their own diagnosis. They certainly weren't going to tell anybody else that they were autistic when they had to endure all of this prejudice and stigma about autism. They feared the negative impact on their careers. One head teacher wrote that he felt it would be a very positive message for autistic pupils, but totally impossible to let anybody know that he was autistic. And he said that he feared accidentally revealing his autistic traits at work. And so perhaps unsurprisingly, there was a certain amount of masking and camouflaging in relation to being autistic in school. And research has shown, quite a lot of research has shown now that having to mask, having to camouflage being autistic is associated with mental health issues and burnout. In fact, from the survey in particular, many of our participants reported mental health issues. This could be a combination of the impact of the environment, the lack of support and understanding, or having to mask being autistic. The high number of social interactions with colleagues and with parents were found to be difficult and exhausting. One teacher said that they had had several false starts and a breakdown before finally getting to a school that was supportive and understanding. Somebody else said poor management, a complete disregard for the fact that she was autistic, led to massive issues, meltdowns, and probable post-traumatic stress disorder. And some of our participants reported that they were going from school to school to try to find an accepting environment. So notwithstanding the difficulties with change, these sort of trigger more changes and having to be exposed to more change because of these issues. And particularly those who had dropped out of the profession, they reported that it was just burnout that they had reached eventually. So to put all of this together in terms of consequences, some of our participants reduced their working hours, or they did not seek promotion opportunities, or they stepped back from senior roles, or indeed they left the profession altogether. Or they might take up visiting roles, which actually can expose people to more uncertainty as well and more change, but at least it means you're not kind of fully committed to that environment, or to take up agency work, which in itself, again, is uncertain. Those who left the profession expressed sadness and regret at having done so. And so there are many strong parallels between these issues and those faced by autistic children. Like the person who said they felt like they are an alien in the staff room, certainly being treated like an alien is something that has come out of my own research in relation to autistic children in schools. Autistic school staff are also experiencing multiple forms of exclusion. And this is across all aspects of the life cycle of their work, from training, recruitment, job retention, promotion, job satisfaction, and well-being. In other words, our study shows that autistic school staff can also be within a vicious cycle of exceptionalism, stigma, and exclusion. Having said that, we do have a number of positives from our study. There aren't as many positives as negatives, but there are a good number of them, and it's important to discuss those as well, of course. Some of our participants, in fact, had a positive experience of sharing the fact that they were autistic. The teaching assistant wrote, "Parents and pupils really appreciate my openness and honesty about my autism." Another teaching assistant, "What I do love, though, is autistic kids' reactions when I tell them I'm autistic. They always receive it well and want to know about how I cope and about my experience. We also gain a bond, like we're suddenly all in the same club." Many of them said that they had a high level of skill and that they had been graded as outstanding in their work. And notwithstanding the issues of change, schools do tend to have a set routine and a set structure, and this suits some autistic people, as well as the pattern of term times, holidays and term times. Some of our participants actually enjoyed change, and they liked that about the teaching profession. And as I mentioned before, particularly senior staff might see themselves as change makers, the people to implement change. And a number of our participants as well had acquired good coping strategies to deal with change that they were able to implement and apply very fruitfully during the COVID-19 changes as well. Now, despite all of the difficulties that they reported, there was a high level of job satisfaction, and the word love was used to describe their attitude towards their work. So 11 of the 149 survey participants said that they loved their work. 63% of our survey participants rated their enjoyment of their work at the two highest levels on a scale of 1 to 5. So notwithstanding all of those issues, the work was enjoyed. Monotropism also was felt by some to be very important, subject specialism and passion. Even the work itself, a senior manager said, "I have found my niche. My job is my hobby." Somebody else said they have a super focus that leads to positive and productive outcomes. And of course, they can understand monotropism in pupils. It's not problematized as it tends to be in most cases. And despite the communication differences in relation to colleagues and also parents, many of them said that they felt they had very strong communication with children, especially those who are autistic or who have other special education needs and disabilities. Some of them felt that they were an important role model for autistic children and parents. They have an understanding of autistic children and other neurodivergent learners. Senko wrote that they can empathize with a group of pupils who much of the time feel different and seek acceptance amongst their peers or even just in their own minds. And this Senko was somebody who hadn't been able to be open about being autistic, but nevertheless was able to implement approaches that were very helpful for autistic pupils. Those who were open about the fact they were autistic were valued by colleagues because of their insights. And they were making an important contribution to educational inclusion, they said, even if they were not able to be open about their diagnosis. This same head teacher, who I mentioned before, who felt it was impossible for him to be open about being autistic, said he can nevertheless run an autistic-friendly school. So to pull some of this together in relation to autistic staff and autistic pupils, both groups can often experience very impactful and difficult sensory issues in the school environment. And I personally believe it's high time this was addressed. They also experience a lack of understanding and support. Some of our participants had shared with managers that they were autistic, they were promised certain accommodations and they were not delivered. They have communication differences with non-autistic or neurotypical peers, as well as social differences. and they experience various forms of exclusion. However, I do think it's very important to not apply a child model to adults. Some of the literature in relation to teachers with disabilities almost suggests a kind of intervention sort of approach. I'm not suggesting that at all. It really is actually about understanding the benefits of valuing and supporting autistic educators. So to draw some conclusions, autistic school staff can and are carrying out a range of roles in schools. As somebody said, we should be everywhere. We already are everywhere. They have unique skills and insights, particularly for alternative learners. But diagnosis is a central issue, or being able to be open about being autistic is a central issue. It must be made safe for autistic school staff to disclose if they wish. Inclusion ultimately will only work if it operates across the whole school community. We have to accept that educational inclusion, not just in relation to autistic children, hasn't really been a great success. And I think one of the factors, one of the reasons for this is that we just don't think about the staff level. And so if we want an inclusive school environment, we must think about the whole community. So I'm just going to tell you about some of our resources now. So we have an e-booklet called Amazing Autistic Teachers, How to Learn from Them. And this is free to download from the Jessica Kingsley Publishers website. You can also get it directly from our own website. So this is drawn from research findings from phase 2 with additional input from autistic teachers, Elke Kammer, our consultant, Alan Morrison, Jade Ponigerai and Matt Woolard. And it's divided into 10 sections that you can see on the right-hand side there. And each of those has a sort of drop down of sort of bullet points. And we cover the kind of life cycle, if you like, of the teacher. And this resource is for autistic teachers specifically. We're developing another one for autistic teaching assistants based on our resource, on our research. Other resources you can find on our website, AutisticSchoolStaffProject.com. You can also find the ebook there as well. We have webinars, research reports, online articles, and if you would like more depth from a kind of academic perspective, then we also have our free access journal article published in Disability and Society. We actually have another article about COVID-19 and change, which is currently under review. Well, I don't know what the outcome of that is yet, but hopefully that will be published before too long. We're very excited. Laura mentioned this at the beginning about our edited book, which is due to be published in 2 weeks' time. So this consists of about 15 chapters from autistic teachers, past and present, in different roles in the schools, covering different perspectives and different experiences. So do keep an eye out for that. In fact, I've learned that the first print run has already sold out, and I'm having to do another one already. Follow us on Twitter on Aut School Staff as well. Finally, I would just like to say a few thank yous. First of all, to our phases 1 and 2 project partners, Dr. Laura Crane, Professor Francesca Happe, Alan Morrison, and Dr. Ruth Moyes, as well as the John and Lorna Ring Foundation for kindly funding this project for phases 2 and 3, which has been incredibly helpful, and also to you for listening. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Becky, for a really, really brilliant talk and for a really important reminder of, I think, the need for inclusion at all levels across the school. I'm just going to stop the recording.